Hello again, students. Let's take a look at chapter 12 material. So again, I'll remind you, get your points by clicking on these links and watching the video and reading the textbook. But let's jump straight into, here we go. For a statistics class experiment, research J. Gilbert decided to study how parents' income affects children's performance on standardized tests. He proposed to collect information from a random sample of test takers and examine the relationship between parental income and SAT scores. Is this an experiment? He did a random sample of test takers and then just polled them. So it's not an experiment. There are no manipulated factors. He looked at the relationship between parental income and SAT scores. Sounds like that's retrospective. They already took the SAT. This one is neither relationship. Yeah, actually, okay, we're going to go with this one is neither for the reason that this is like he's looking at current time values. Yeah, they already took the test, but it's not like he's looking far back. Like if you were looking 5-10 years back, I'd classify that as a retrospective study. So let's go with neither. Okay. If there's a relationship between parental income and SAT score, why can't we conclude that differences in score are caused by differences in parental income? I can only draw causality from experiments, not from relationships. So let's see. There may be lurking variables that are associated with both parental income and performance on SAT. In countries known to contain lower levels of vitamin D, there were more reported cases of a particular type of rare disease. The researchers hypothesized that a deficiency in vitamin D would increase the risk of developing the disease. These researchers compared vitamin D levels in blood samples from 100 exchange students who have developed the disease with blood samples of nearly 310 who have not. The samples were taken on average 5 years before the disease was diagnosed. Those with the highest blood vitamin D levels had 75% lower risk of developing the disease than those with the lowest levels. All right, what kind of study is this? This sounds like it's prospective because we did blood samples of 100 exchange students and then waited 5 years, right? Oh. Okay. Let's see what I missed. Some researchers hypothesized a deficiency in vitamin D would increase the risk of developing disease. These researchers compared vitamin D levels in blood samples from 100 exchange students. Oh, I'm sorry, who have developed the disease. I didn't read that carefully. I thought they were collecting the blood and then following them in the future, but it says they are collecting the blood from people who already developed the disease, right? So this would be retrospective. Well, wait a minute. The samples were taken on average 5 years before the disease was diagnosed. So this is just simply observational, right? Is that what I missed? That it needs to be prospective and observational, that you can mark more than one? Retrospective and observational. Good grief. Okay, there we go. So retrospective because they did they collected the blood samples. So they went back and looked at the blood samples that were collected after they knew who had the disease and who didn't. That's why it's retrospective. Is that an appropriate choice for investigating this problem? Yes, because the disease in the study is a rare disease, a retrospective study is appropriate. All right. And who were the subjects? The exchange students who had their blood collected, right? Exchange students who have developed the disease with blood samples of nearly 310 who have not. So it's just exchange students who had their blood collected. What were the variables? The level of vitamin D for the subject and the percent lower risk in obtaining the disease. The number of subjects who developed the disease, no. The level of vitamin D for the subject and whether or not the subject developed the disease. And okay, yeah, that should be fine. Okay. An experiment tested the ability of maggots to remove dead tissue from open wounds that would not heal on their own. Sterile this is actually a real thing, by the way, guys, in case you didn't know it. It's one of our incredibly gross medical facts, but maggots actually can be used in this way. Like Google it, I'm sure it's online. Sterile maggots were placed in a small pouch, which in turn was placed on the wound. 100 men with wounds on their upper limbs were randomly assigned to receive either a traditional surgical treatment or maggot therapy. Woohoo, you're getting maggot therapy. After 8 days, the percentage of dead tissue in the wounds that underwent, this is so gross. Okay. Neither patients nor the doctors evaluating the wounds knew which therapy had been applied. Surprisingly, the number of patients that reported a crawling sensation. All right. What kind of study was this? All right. So now let's see what we did here. So the maggots were placed on the wound. 100 men with wounds on their upper limbs were randomly assigned. So that is an experiment. Okay. Placebo controlled. Well, we've got the control group, right? They're either receiving the traditional surgical treatment or the maggots. Neither the patients nor the doctors knew which therapy had been applied. That would be double blind. So this is a double blind experiment. What are we missing? So it has to be the placebo control because a control group was used, or the block. It's not really blocked though. All right, they weren't blocked. Double blind and randomized, but that is an experiment also. Well, it is an experiment, so I don't know why they're not marking an experiment.